Hey, finance students, welcome to week 5. We are in chapter 14. We are talking about weighted average cost of capital. Now that we've looked at bonds in week 3 and stocks in week 4, we have an understanding of what makes up the capital structure of an organization. And we can put them together to understand what it's really costing them, any organization, what it's really costing any organization to use other people's money, including bondholders and stockholders. And we're going to look at it a quantitative assessment. We're going to look at the math behind it to be able to calculate what the weighted average cost of capital is for an organization. Now, we do have to understand that investment instruments to investors are considered returns and considered instruments of return, but to the issuer, to the company that issues the bonds and the stocks, they are a cost factor because in essence, investors do require returns on their investments, and those returns can be considered a cost to the organization of doing business, of using other people's money. So when we talk about weighted average cost of capital, we're talking about combining cost of debt and cost of equity. And just very simply reviewing week 3 and week 4, week 3, the cost of bonds is calculated by looking at the yield to maturity. So the cost of bonds is essentially the yield to maturity, the rate that we find that is the yield to maturity on a bond. And the cost of equity is our K in our formula, or R of S or R of J, that we can use by finding either the CAPM formula or by using the dividend growth model. We can find those required rates of return for either of those, which in essence is the cost of equity. So knowing that, we can look at how to calculate cost of equity for stocks and bonds and put them together to understand the weighted average cost of capital, the overall cost of capital for an organization. So we're going to look here at ICA 14.1, and we're going to look at a couple of problems here. Let's just kind of review, how do we find the cost of debt within an organization? And so we'll start with the first one, looking at the after-tax cost of debt. Remember, interest payments on debt are tax deductible, and therefore it lowers, because you can take a deduction on your taxes, it essentially lowers the cost of debt for an organization. So let's look at the first one. The Jubilee Jacket Company currently has outstanding 9% coupon bonds that have a yield to maturity of 12.5%. The company believes that it could issue new bonds at par value that would provide the same yield to maturity. If the company's marginal tax rate is 35%, what is the after-tax cost of debt? So we are looking for the cost, or the cost of debt for this company is what we're looking at, after tax. So we should put after tax. All right. So in order to find that, we know that after tax cost of debt is equal to the before tax times before tax cost of debt times 1 minus your tax rate. That is a formula that's been given to us in this chapter. So we need our before tax cost of debt, which we know is our yield to maturity. So the yield to maturity would have is 12.5% that we can enter here, 12.5%. 12.5%, my keyboard. There we go, 12.5%. And we know our tax rate is 35% that we can punch in there, so 35%. So using our formula that we have here, we can do our previous before tax cost of debt times 1 minus my tax rate of 35%. It gives us an after-tax cost of, if we did that right, let's see, our before tax 12.5, 35. After-tax cost of debt should be about 8.13%. So that's how we calculate the after-tax cost of debt. But sometimes we're not necessarily given the yield to maturity. We're given all the bond information, like here, where we'll have to calculate the yield to maturity first, then find the after-tax cost of debt. So let's look at this one. Menard Corporation issues a $1,000 par value 20-year bond with a coupon rate of 10%. Coupons are semi-annual. Bond sells for $9.90. Marginal tax rate is 30%. What is the pre-tax and after-tax cost of debt and after-tax cost of debt for Menard Corporation? So we need our pre-tax. So this is pre-tax or before tax cost of debt, and this would be after tax cost of debt, which we already have there, but just as a comparison we see. So we need to calculate our yield to maturity. And if you remember how we do that, we use our rate function in Excel after we find all of our information. So our coupon rate we know is 10%. We know there's 20 years. There's 20 years on the bond, but it has 40 years or 40 periods total that we would have. Okay. Payment then, we know our par value is $1,000. So we know that our payment is going to be our coupon rate divided by 2 times my par value. So we know it's a $50 payment. We also know the present value is $990. So that gives us that. So now that we have coupon rate, number of periods, payment, present value, future value, we can run our rate function. Rate function with number of periods of 40, my payment of $50, present value is $990, future value is $1,000. Now they give me a pound or hashtag num. What that tells me is I did not include at least one negative cash flow. So I'm going to change, let's see, the payment should be, the present value should be a negative because that'd be what we bought it for. So we have our pre-tax cost of debt at 5.06, but that's semi-annual, so we have to double that, 5.06 times 2, to get our yield to maturity, our pre-tax yield to maturity, our annual rate. Now that we have that, our tax rate we know is 30%, so we can enter that in there. And by using our formula that we have up here, our after-tax cost of debt is our previous tax, our yield to maturity minus 1 minus our tax rate. So that would be our yield to maturity pre-tax times 1 minus our tax rate. Plug that in. We have an enter, so that would give us an after-tax cost of debt of 7.08%. Okay, so if we look down here at Waco, we see all this information given to us, and all we need to do is find our after-tax cost of debt. Well, we know our after-tax cost of debt is 1 minus the tax rate times our before tax, our yield to maturity. If we look here, we see our yield to maturity on bonds is given to us right there. So we have that. So we have our before tax, our yield to maturity. We can multiply that times 1 minus, and we need a tax rate, and we have our tax rate that's right here at 38%. So we have our before tax rate of 8.2% times 1 minus our tax rate of 38%. So Waco's after-tax cost of debt, we would calculate that at 5.08%. All right, now we're going to move on to 14.2 and look at cost of equity.